Our evening's event tonight, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in Conversation, celebrates the launch of the Department of English in the School of Arts and Social Sciences here at City University of London this academic year. We've only been a department since September. We're only in the second year of a BA English program, an innovative and unique approach which combines the traditional study of literature in English with creative and professional writing. It's an exciting time for us as we work to develop postgraduate programs in English and to reshape and revision our long-standing postgraduate programs in publishing and creative writing. I'm deeply honored to introduce our guest this evening, the internationally renowned Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Ms. Adichie first came to international recognition with the publication of her first novel, Purple Hibiscus, in 2003. The novel, a searing account of the ways in which domestic violence impacts a family in post-colonial Nigeria, went on to win the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Her 2006 novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, is set prior to and during the Biafran War. It too won many prizes, including the top prize for female writers, the Orange Prize, which is now called the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, and was adapted as a film of the same name released in 2013. Her most recent novel is the 2013 Americana, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was named one of the top 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. With its range across 3 continents and its span of decades, Americana richly showcases Ms. Adichie's keen eye for detailing the impact of global and racial tensions on the lives of her characters. It examines Black experience in Nigeria, London, and the U.S. through an array of lenses, including identity and relationships, community, ethnocentrism, privilege, class, migration, and appearance, and even hair. Ms. Adichie has also published a number of celebrated short stories, many of them collected in the 2009 The Thing Around Your Neck. She's received so many awards and honors, I'm not going to list them all, sorry about that, including the prestigious MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, aka the Genius Grant, in 2008, as well as honorary degrees from Johns Hopkins University, Haverford College, and the University of Edinburgh. She has become as celebrated for her interventions into contemporary debates about race and feminism as she has for her fiction. Her 2014 TED Talk, We Should All Be Feminists, has helped invigorate a wave of feminist activism and arguably laid the foundation for our current moment of feminist awareness with the rise of Time's Up and the Me Too movements, as well as the possibility that a sitting U.S. president might be brought down by a porn actress named Stormy Daniels. Gives new meaning to that old Bob Dylan line, the President of the United States sometimes must have to stand naked. We Should All Be Feminists was published as a book in 2015. Another essay on feminism, Dear Ijiyawele, or A Feminist Manifesto and 15 Suggestions, developed out of a friend's request that Ms. Adichie explain how to raise a feminist daughter. Published in 2017, the essay captures Ms. Adichie's gift for focusing on the specifics of Nigerian women, while at the same time touching on the vexed sexual politics that characterize gender relations in other parts of the world. As one reviewer wrote, we need to know the capacious, volatile Nigerian contemporary culture where a daughter might be told to bend down properly while sweeping like a girl, or tease that she is old enough to find a husband, also includes Adichie and her friends. They demand the whole lot for women, everything any woman could want anywhere, full equality and opportunity for selfhood and education, sexual freedom and freedom from shame, shared childcare and domestic work, their own surnames. The old asks, which in the UK can seem to have shrunk to conventional pieties or surface adjustments strained uneasily over complex realities, recover their freshness in a new context. The thinking that informs Ms. Adichie's well-known 2009 TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, is particularly significant to me and my fellow English department staff members as we work to develop a global and transnational curriculum that does not simply reproduce the limitations and biases of the study of English literature in traditional English departments. In her talk, Ms. Adichie stresses the danger of cultural underrepresentation, drawing upon her personal experiences of growing up and reading stories in which the characters were primarily Caucasian. Now, I loved those American and British books I read, she comments. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me, but the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. As we move forward with developing our curriculum, we will be ensuring that the literatures in English that we teach include all the places and people across the globe whose stories can and must be heard. As Salman Rushdie has famously commented, English lit has never been in better shape because the world language now also possesses a world literature which is proliferating in every conceivable direction. The English language ceased to be the sole possession of the English some time ago. Her work adds immeasurably to that global conversation. She will be in a somewhat smaller conversation tonight with Dr. Louisa Egbunike, a lecturer in our department who joined us in September. Dr. Egbunike received her PhD from SOAS in 2015 with a dissertation entitled The Igbo Experience in the Igbo-Nigerian Novel, which explores contemporary literary representations of the development of a pan-Igbo identity. A second project, Cartographies of Resistance, Brixton in the Black British Imaginary, identifies Brixton as a space of protest, cultural production, and dispossession. Dr. Egbunike has published extensively on Black writers, including Bessie Head, Buchi Emecheta, Chinua Achebe, and Ms. Adichie herself. An active and engaged scholar who is committed to studying, writing about, and teaching works that record contemporary Black experience in Britain, Nigeria, and the U.S., Dr. Egbunike recently curated an exhibition which launched at SOAS in January of artists' responses to the legacies of Biafra. The exhibition will open at the Africa Center later this year and then will go on to tour internationally. Dr. Egbunike was also named as one of the New Generation Thinkers by the BBC AHRC, a small group of 10 early career researchers whose remit is to create content and generate new ideas for BBC Radio 3. She has done a Sunday feature on Afrofuturism in an African context and produced a short film for BBC Arts Online on her father's account of living in Britain during the Biafran War. Please join with me in welcoming our speakers.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Can I just start by saying what a pleasure and honor it is to be sat here with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And thank you very much for coming and joining us here at City. As Patricia said, we're a new department, and I think we're launching really with a bang this year. And this is part of that bang. So thank you for being part of our bang. So I've got some series of broad topics, and there's going to be ample time for Q&A afterwards. But just to start with, what are you reading now?
That's a really good start. Right? Whenever I'm asked that question, I go blank, and then afterwards I remember. But I want to say I'm happy to be here. I'm here because of Louisa, really, and I'm here because of Louisa and Yvonne, who's in the audience. And it's very nice to be here, and thank you for that kind introduction. You reminded me of some things about myself that I had forgotten, so that's always a good thing. I usually read, one of the things that's happened to me from living in the US off and on is that my attention span has become significantly reduced. And so I'm now unable to read one book and sustain interest in it without reading something else. So I usually read a novel, nonfiction, poetry all at the same time. This is not something I recommend, by the way. But
well, so that's what our students do, hopefully. So
I think sometimes it can take from the pleasure. I mean, it works for me, but I wonder sometimes if it means that I don't get the full pleasure of all of the books, you know. But anyway, so I'm reading Ifeoma Jume's book about gender in Nigeria, female husbands, male wives, or something it's called. And the poetry that I'm reading is by an African-American poet called Terence Hayes. I'm also reading Tracy K. Smith's poetry, because when I write fiction, I like to read poetry more than fiction, because I'm worried about the possibility of unplanned influence. And I actually just finished reading a novel by, it's called Salt House. And it's a really lovely novel. It's about, I think it really humanizes the Palestinian story. It has the setting is sort of 60 years of a family's life from Palestine, and then some of them moved to Kuwait, but I found it quite a beautiful novel. I've just finished that, and I'm not sure what I'm going to read next. I'm probably going to read Elizabeth Hardwick, who I deeply, deeply admire.
And of course, in addition to writing, you also lead workshops in Nigeria every summer. And can you maybe point us in the direction of any sort of emerging talents from Nigeria? And what are the new things that these writers are doing?
They're doing, one of the things I find really exciting about my workshops is, first of all, so many people apply. There's so much talent. And my vision for it is a very Pan-African vision. So, and for me, Pan-Africanism doesn't end with the continent. It includes the people whose forebears came from the continent. And I've just been amazed by the talent. And it's also a broad range of people writing about modern life in Nigeria, writing about what it means to be gay, and what it means to live between that sort of that tension of having come back from abroad, back to Nigeria, and what it means to try and become Nigerian again. People writing about, so it's really, it's so broad and so exciting. There's a young writer called Uzamaka Anyuno, who actually is now acting, so I think we might have lost her. But she's very good. There's, see, I'm completely blanking. I'll send you a list later.
That's fine, and we'll circulate that.
But what I can tell you is that the state of literature in Nigeria is well, healthy. Yes.
And so in terms of sort of new directions, I mean, I've noticed that there's been a plethora of writing that's classed as either Afrofuturist or science fiction. I know that I've heard an interview you say you're not a massive fan of science fiction as a genre, but it struck me reading the short story Ghost and the thing around your neck that there's a kind of a supernatural element to it. So not science fiction, but sort of part of a broader speculative fiction. And I wondered if we can expect any more of that kind of writing from you.
How many more ghosts will be in your stories, Chimamanda? It's really what Louisa is saying. I don't know. And I think it's very, you're putting it very politely, saying I'm not a massive fan. I don't like it at all. I just can't do science fiction, I'm sorry. And I completely respect that this is something people like. And actually at my workshop, I try to have one or two people who do science fiction. But I don't also feel equipped to help them to sort of shape their story well, because I don't know what the hell is going on. I think I have a philosophical objection to science fiction, which is to say that in a world in which anything can happen, then anything can happen. And fans of science fiction have said to me, no, you build the world and it has its own rules in the way that sort of natural laws apply when you write realistic fiction. But I just don't, I don't know. But I think for me the story Ghost doesn't really, well, I suppose it is a certain kind of speculative fiction, but if you think of it in terms of Igbo cosmology, it's real. The ghost is real. Yeah. And I think of it when people talk about magical realism. And there are many societies in the world in which what we call magical realism in the West isn't magical at all. So the idea of Obanje, for example, in Igbo land, and the idea that a child is born and keeps coming back. And if you talk about that in sort of Western circles, you're supposed to couch it in the language of the magical realism. But actually, for people in that world, it's not magical. It's perfectly real and normal. So I don't know if I'm going to do any more speculative fiction. But you're right, though, that there's a new flowering of African science fiction and fantasy. And I'm happy for any writing to happen. So
And I mean, the point you raised there about one person's reality could be seen as like magical realism in other contexts. I mean, that sort of ties in with the conversations around the decolonizing, right? Shifting the center, centering different realities, not always reading everything through the lens of the West. And that's part of a conversation that's taking place across Britain now. There's a sort of student-led movement to decolonize our universities. And I wondered, as somebody who's grown up on a university campus, and of course the universities in Nigeria had to go through a process of decolonization after independence, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this process of decolonizing.
I don't know. What shape does it take exactly in this country? I mean, what is it?
So in universities in Britain, many students are querying or questioning the centering of sort of, in the English department, for example, the canon, and the, sort of the sometimes tokenistic inclusion of writers from other parts of the world. And so rather than maybe diversifying a curriculum, actually completely rethinking the structure.
Well, I grew up in Nsukka, and Nsukka in some ways was different because Nsukka was actually Nigeria's first indigenous university. So it started off with a certain, I mean, it was deeply influenced by the US because it was mostly funded by the US. But I think there was the sort of the ethos of the university was one that was Nigerian. The idea was to have an institution that was rooted in its Nigerianness. But, to the larger point of, but I think it's also interesting that in many Nigerian universities, the curriculum could do with some decolonizing. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So I don't know, I mean, I do think it's important to have a wide range of what literature means. And to define literature in a very narrow way, I think it's a disservice to everyone. So,
and I mean,
so don't just read Achebe,
Don't just read Adichie as well.
No, that's not what I mean. I think that Achebe, I think in the US, I can't speak for the UK because I don't know it well, but I think in the US, what happens is, you have kids in high schools especially, they read, they read To Kill a Mockingbird, they read, they read the American books, they read Moby Dick, they read, and then they throw in Achebe. It's sort of like, well, look, we have a black person.
And then Achebe speaks. And then Achebe speaks for the whole of Africa or the whole of the global south.
Yeah, not just Africa.
Yeah.
Achebe is just like, oh, we have a... Achebe speaks even for China.
Yeah. And I mean, we're a new English department, and so we're sort of coming into being and developing our own personality and developing our curriculum. If you were given the powers to set up an English department or to set up a department of literature, what might it look like? What would you call it? Because there's also a debate around whether or not we should call these departments English and what that means to call it an English department as opposed to maybe a literature department.
See, this is the reason why I'm not an academic. I feel like academics spend so much time debating this sort of thing, and meanwhile, just right outside, real problems are festering. Honestly, I'm like, I don't care. No, but really, no, I don't want to be too flippant because I do think it matters to a certain extent. I do think it matters because representation matters and symbolism matters, right? If I had that power, and I do like to have power, I would. But it's different. I mean, English and literature, those are two very different things. So this is an English department. Is it also a literature department? Okay.
I'm looking at our head of department.
That's what I would call it. And it's not just English literature. So it's literatures in English.
And also creative writing and also translation and publishing. So
I would call it the Department of Words.
Okay.
But what I would do, and I try to do this when I teach writing, is to have students have a wide range of what they read. I remember teaching. I did a fellowship at Princeton, so I taught writing for a semester. And I remember some of the students just being surprised. One student said to me, I had them read Patrick Chamoiseau, yes, and a short story. And I remember one student saying to me, oh, I didn't know people from there wrote books. So he didn't think that people from the Caribbean wrote books. And he was, this sort of young, earnest person. And I remember thinking, you've probably gone to a very good high school. Now you're in Princeton. You are part of the sort of ostensible elite that will go on to rule the world. And at this stage, you don't know that people in the Caribbean write. I mean, I found that quite remarkable. So I just think it's really important to know that the world is not this tiny bubble in which one lives. And literature is such a wonderful way of humanizing the world. You read, and I think at the end of that semester, I think the students had changed in just the way they thought about what is often in academic circles called the other.
I mean, in The Danger of a Single Story, you speak about the power of literature and the power of Western literature to kind of construct an Africa that is othered.
Yeah.
And this sort of engagement with the ongoing legacy of colonization is something that features throughout your work. And I wonder if you could just say a few words on what drives you to write those kinds of stories and sort of what you see that legacy to be in sort of contemporary Nigeria now.
I think what drives me simply is a kind of passion and what I feel strongly about. So growing up in Nigeria and having a very firm sense of who I was and where I came from. I grew up in Igbo land, and I grew up in a university community, so there was a sense in which it was also quite cosmopolitan, but it was deeply rooted in its Igbo-ness. And so I grew up very much aware of who I was and what I was, and grew up quite proud of being, an Igbo woman. But also I was alert and aware of how, for example, in primary school, you weren't supposed to speak the vernacular, except for an Igbo class. And I remember even then finding it ridiculous, that you could be punished for doing what? Speaking the vernacular. I'm just like, it's stupid, because this vernacular is actually your language. Yeah. But what it does is that there's something insidious that it can do to you. It can mess up your head. It can make you start to think that what is yours is something for which to feel shame. And I think I resisted that from very early on. And there was a sense in which I wanted my work to also be a kind of resistance to that kind of idea. So I would throw in Igbo words in my novels, because I wanted to create the texture of the world I was writing about. Because in my world, I speak Igbo and English often at the same time, often in the same sentence. And so I wanted to capture that in my fiction. And I remember when my first novel was finished, my very kind American editor said to me, and it's really good, but I think we need to take out a lot of the dialect. So I then said, very nicely, well, I would like you to say language, not dialect, because it's not a dialect, it's a language. And then I said to her, I've read so many books recently published in the US in which bits of Spanish were thrown in, bits of French. Why is mine different? And when I think about it now, I was so grateful to be published, because I had a hard time before somebody actually had agreed to publish my book, because they would say to me, oh, we like your writing, but nobody knows where Nigeria is. And so when finally somebody, this is true though, and when finally somebody said yes, when I look back now, I think I really had some nerve, because on the one hand, I was very grateful to be published. But then on the other, I remember thinking, no, you're not going to take out the Igbo in my book. And if that is the condition, then I'll go, I'll keep looking, because somehow it will happen. But eventually she understood, because I made the case for the idea that Igbo is just as much a language as French and Spanish, which is something that in sort of the global stage isn't often the case, which is also why often when people think about African languages, they often resort to using the word dialect. And I find that really irritating. But just other things, the idea of what it means to be African. And for me, it's not a question of romanticizing Africa, right? Or romanticizing our past, because there are many things that are wrong and that I don't like. But it's simply a case of taking ownership and occupying my own space. And it's an African space. It's a space that I'm very comfortable in the world. But I think part of that is because I know who I am and I know where I come from. And from there, I can sort of go wherever I want. And I kind of want my fiction to do that. I cannot tell you how surprised I was when, after Purple Hibiscus was published, many Americans just came up to me in surprise. And the professor at Hopkins who said to me, I don't believe your story. And I said to him, why? And he said, because it isn't authentically African. And just thinking about it now, here was this white American man, very well read, a professor at Hopkins, and here I was, African, grew up in Nigeria, but somehow he was certain that he knew what was authentically African. And just to think about it is to realize, it's a problem. But, and I think what he meant was that my characters were actually he said they're too familiar. So they weren't exotic enough. And I think this kind of thinking is not just within academia. It's the same kind of thinking that makes people who travel to countries in Africa say things like, oh, we want to see the authentic African. So somehow, if you're educated, you're not authentic enough. So they want to see the African in the beads and the raffia skirts and the dancing. And not to say that those are not important, but just simply to say that there's something very dangerous about limiting what Africa means to a certain kind of exotic stereotype.
And I mean, in your writing, you do sort of center an Africa that sort of reflects, or I should say Nigeria, that reflects the sort of environment that you were familiar with.
Yeah.
And what impact has that had in Nigeria and other parts of Africa? I mean, again, here we are looking at Africa through a complex lens, or looking at Nigeria through a complex lens, showing a range of characters with different experiences. And how have Nigerians reacted to your work?
When Half of a Yellow Sun came out, my publisher said to me, you have to be prepared for anything. So I remember thinking at my first event in Lagos that they might stone me. So I wore armor underneath my dress. I've actually been really, I felt grateful and happy about being, I'm read in Nigeria and read in schools as well. But what I love is to hear from people who say, yours was the first book I had to read for school that I actually enjoyed reading. Because I know what it's like to have to go through. I remember I couldn't bear Macbeth in secondary school. So it's always lovely to hear that. And Half of a Yellow Sun, I think because it was about this part of our history that's so contested still, and contentious, Biafra, it was, and I knew writing that book that it would be read not just as literature but as history. And I knew that it started many intense conversations. Actually, one of the events I did in Lagos was sort of one part of the hall versus the other part, and people just going at each other. You don't know what my family went through. Oh, not, all of that. And I like that very much because I think that literature should start conversations. Right? Literature should speak to us. And also, I think that literature is a way to talk about things that might be almost impossible to talk about otherwise. There were people who couldn't talk about Biafra, but when they talked about it using characters in a novel, it became doable. And I think Americana, which I wasn't sure would work well in Nigeria, because I think in some ways it's my most, I think it's very Nigerian. All of my work is Nigerian, but because a lot of it is set in the US and some of it in the UK, I wasn't sure how it would be. But I was very happy shortly after I came out in Lagos to see it in the traffic, which was a good sign, because when a book is being hawked in traffic in Lagos, it's, I was like, I've arrived.
You spoke about Biafra there. You said that you describe yourself as having grown up in the shadows of Biafra. And I just wanted, and of course, I've done some work on Biafra myself with the exhibition, and what you were saying resonated with me in terms of having art as a medium for people to engage, and there's a way in which it opens up conversations that maybe had been closed down before. Yeah. I wonder if you can say something about the shadows of Biafra cast over the nation at large.
I think one of the things that I was struck by growing up was how little was said about Biafra. So on the one hand, you knew that it had happened. My mother would often, for my parents, a lot of their stories were before the war and after the war. And I was struck by still how little was said. So I knew the war had happened. I didn't quite know what had happened, because things were never said in any detail and never in a clear narrative form. It was sort of little bits. And mostly also because of my grandfather. I grew up not knowing my grandfather because he died in a refugee camp in Biafra. Actually, both my grandfathers died in refugee camps, but my father talked a lot about his father. So we all grew up kind of knowing everything about our grandfather. And I think as a child, it was a part of me that realized that this man, who seemed really lovely, the reason I didn't know him was because the war had taken him. And maybe that's why I then became haunted by it. But in a larger sense, I knew that Nigeria was also a place where you were not supposed to talk about Biafra. I don't think anybody ever said to me, you cannot, but you just knew. And when I started researching Half of a Yellow Sun, if I told people I'm writing a book about Biafra, the response invariably from Igbo people, non-Igbo people, what are you doing? Leave it alone. You're looking for trouble. Leave it alone. So it was sort of hush-hush, Biafra, no, no, no. And I think that kind of hush-hush led to many cases of ignorance. People just didn't know. People knew the wrong thing, and in some ways it made me even more determined to write about it. And I remember even when I started out to ask questions, because I read everything I could find about Biafra. I looked at the archives, I listened to radio broadcasts from that period, but then I wanted to talk to people. And I remember there was often reluctance, especially if you made it clear that, I'm writing a book about Biafra, so I want you to tell me. People would often just start to perform. And so I realized that the way to go about it was not to tell them that it was, so just to say, in 1967, what did you have for breakfast? And that often opened up a different kind of story. And that's what I needed for my fiction, because I wanted people's stories to give it the heart, because I knew the facts from the books. But I think largely what it said to me was that there was just a shroud of silence around that period. I think it's a bit different now. And I think that Half of Yellow Sun really contributed to that. But there's still, I think, a lot of stories still untold. Biafra is still very much a contested, even the word Biafra. And even the way that we choose to say it. So I choose to say the Nigeria-Biafra War. And you can tell from people who choose to say the Nigerian Civil War, even that means something, right? Because to say the Nigerian Civil War is implicitly to say that Biafra was never a country. But I say Nigeria-Biafra War because if I don't say that, then somehow I'm not honoring my grandfather, because my grandfather died in a country that he believed was Biafra.
We were actually having this conversation earlier, Patricia and I, about the various ways of describing it and the kind of politics of that. So just on the theme of silence and silencing, actually, I wanted to touch on the current sort of Me Too movement and think about or discuss your thoughts on how this, why now, basically? Why is feminism now back in sort of public consciousness? Why is there sort of growth in feminist activism? What is it about this moment that has created around the world this eruption, this movement?
Do you know, I really think that the American president is a major part of that.
We had this conversation also.
I do. Because somebody at this table is an American. You must be held responsible. No. I really think that the American president has contributed to that simply by being president, the person of the president, who we know has molested women, because we know from what he said, but who also just, I think, well, there's that, but also just represents a certain kind of sort of casual, ugly misogyny. A person who you can just tell doesn't think very much of women, in the way that he speaks about women, in the way that you can, it's so obvious. And I think to have that person then ascend to this position of just enormous power, I think it did something. And maybe the first manifestation of that was the Women's March all across the US. It just felt so, I couldn't believe how many people came out and just the depth of feeling. And so I think that's actually been a major reason. But I also think that there's been a kind of incremental progression in the awareness of the fact that there's still a lot to be done. That idea that somehow that gender is fine, women are okay, everything's fine, which I think was a lie that the West told itself for some decades. I think people started to realize, actually, it's a really big lie. And so incrementally, and then it seems to me that the American president became the kind of the catalyst that just made more things happen.
And do you see this as an enduring movement, or is it just the current
I hope
trend?
It's enduring. I don't know. I find myself feeling cautiously optimistic, but I don't know. I think just knowing enough about justice movements and what happens is there's progress, and then suddenly you just find that that everything seems to be regressing. I hope it's I hope it's the start of a real revolution. I know that people sometimes talk about, oh, there's backlash. And I just feel like, well, so what? There's always backlash. The point is simply to keep pressing forward. But I don't know. I hope so. I wish we had, I want us to have more stories. I want us to have more conversations about Me Too. And what I mean is to say that often in the media, people will say, oh, he's been accused of sexual misconduct. I don't know what that means. What does sexual misconduct mean? And I think language matters, because if we shroud what happens in this kind of opaque language, it's very easy for people, the backlash will happen more, because people will be like, oh, it's a witch hunt, we don't know, he didn't do anything, maybe he just smiled at her and now he's been fired, Yeah. So I feel like we need to hear the stories, we need to know what the hell happened, and also we need to be able to make the distinction between what is consensual and what is not, because the people who've said, for example, there was a letter written by the French women who said, oh, it means women can't have sexual lives. And I thought, actually, Me Too has nothing to do with women's sexual lives. When you walk into a man's office and he brings out his penis, it has nothing to do with the woman's desire. Because nobody's asked her if she wants to see the damn penis. So I kind of feel that we need to have more stories and more conversations and use less opaque language. And that also that it translates to serious policy, that when people are hired and that all of that. I don't know. I don't know. I hope so.
Mm-hmm. And just on the conversation around language, I wanted to sort of discuss with you your embracing of the term feminism and feminist, and just to sort of couch it in within Nigerian women writers circles, someone like Buchi Emecheta, who famously said, if I'm going to be called a feminist, it'll be with a small f. And I remember reading, I think, Diplomatic Pounds on the back. You'd written something where you described yourself as a black, African, happy feminist. So what made you sort of drop the black, African happy and just be feminist?
Well, because actually part of all of those sort of qualifiers that I had used were, they were half in jest, but they also spoke to what I think is the stereotypes around feminism. Right? That when I said I was a feminist, somebody would say to me, oh, feminists are just women who cannot find husbands. They're just angry women. They're women who don't shave their legs. They're women who don't, wear deodorant. Not that I necessarily do, but they're women who, that kind of thing. And so I found myself having to say, and then they would say to me, it's not African. Which I found very stupid. And so I then started to say, well, I'm an African feminist. And then I'm a happy feminist. Oh, I'm a feminist who likes lipstick. I'm a feminist who likes, but the point was, it was my way of sort of poking fun at the stereotypes. I chose feminist because I like the dictionary meaning. And because I think we need a word around which to rally. But it's also not, it wasn't done without acknowledging that it's also a loaded word because of its history. But it's its history in the West. I think because Western feminism is the only feminism that's been so well documented, people often think it's the only feminism. So people have said to me, I would like you to speak to the second wave. And I'm just like, I don't know. I mean, my mother was working in Nigeria when Americans were doing the second wave. I don't even know what that means, right? So it's the narrative of the Western narrative of feminism is not mine. I don't identify with it. I did not become a feminist because I read some Western text. I became a feminist because I watched my world and I just didn't understand why women and men were not treated the same way. Right? So I choose feminist because, but I think that to choose that is not to say that I don't recognize things like the racism of Western feminism and the racism in the history of Western feminism, where women of color were really excluded and where often women in the discourse meant white women, which actually hasn't really changed very much in political discourse in America. So they'll say to you, women voted 72% and black people voted 87%. And then I'm thinking, wait, hold on, where am I? Because they do it all the time, right? Because the assumption, and it's almost automatic, that women means white women. And then there's black people. And somehow, black women get forgotten in the middle. We're like, wait, where do we fit in, And also, no, it's not, but I like the word feminist. There are people who have said, oh, why don't you say you're a womanist? Because, Alice Walker said womanist. And I don't want to, partly because there are interpretations of womanism that I'm not comfortable with. I think that it kind of can make a fetish of sort of women and fertility and motherhood. And I'm a mother, and I think it's glorious, but I don't think that motherhood should define what it means to be a woman, because there are many women who choose not to be mothers, and we should respect that. So there's a lot about sort of, and also because I think that there are things that women of all races and classes can identify with. That's why I like feminism. I think that there are things that that I can talk to a white woman from Norway about that my black brother will not get, because he just won't. And so because of that, I really do believe in a kind of overarching idea of women having similar experiences. And I think it's really just about socialization, that if the world sees you as a woman, the world treats you in a particular way. Other things kind of get in the way, right? So, which is why, for example, 52% of white women voted for the American president. And it's not the woman part of them that did that, it's the white part. It's true.
And you've spoken about how your feminism is very much rooted in your Igbo, Nigerian, African heritage. And I think for me, it's the kind of the shift that's taken place in terms of, as you mentioned, feminism had been structured or had been presented as something that happened in the West and then was almost exported to Africa, and African women then sort of learned about how to become emancipated, and that was the order of things. And I think it's fascinating now that, for example, We Should All Be Feminists is given to school children in Sweden. And so the kind of shift, albeit a small shift, but that, I think, is beautiful. And I'm so grateful for that you're part of this shift. And I wonder, how has your talks and your writing on feminism been received in Nigeria? Again, because you're writing from that context.
Yes. Not very well, I'm afraid. Chimamanda wants to destroy marriages. That's usually what happens, yeah. And then, and it's true. It's actually, I get all kinds of things. So there's and I've met quite a few sort of parents, older people, who've said to me, my daughters love you, and I'm very worried about that. And they say to me, my daughters follow everything you say. Sometimes our daughters argue with us, and then they start by saying, Chimamanda says, and then they tell me we're worried because we worry that they will never get married. And even them saying that, for me, I think it's so sad that still, with ostensibly progressive parents, there's a sense in which girls' lives are still not giving full value until somehow marriage has validated it. It's still such a sad thing. I think that there are young Nigerian women who are telling their stories, speaking up. But I know that feminism is just not. If you make the choice to publicly identify as feminist, you have to be prepared for hostility. That's anywhere in the world, by the way, not just Nigeria. Right? So when I sort of came out as feminist, I knew that actually when I gave that TED talk, I remember right afterwards this couple coming to me, and this man just looked very unhappy. He's like, I really used to love everything you did. I read all your books. And now he's like, I'm not sure. And he's like, what? Now you're saying, and I think people get uncomfortable with the idea of disrupting the status quo. And of course, there are men who think that they're going to lose out in some way. And if you've been thrust in a position of privilege that you haven't really earned, you don't want to lose it. And so there's a sense in which I understand why they feel that way. But I'm also kind of hopeful, because We Should All Be Feminists did very well in Nigeria. And it's often something that, I know young people are constantly debating. You're a feminist. Well, will you not cook for your husband? Blah, blah, blah. And a lot of these conversations I find to be just infantile. But the fact that we are, in fact, having these conversations, the fact that feminist is a word that is familiar to many, many people in Nigeria now, in a way that wasn't the case 7 years ago, I find that very hopeful. And also that men are coming on board. Right? And that's something that, for me, is a reason for hope. Because I think we can change everything we want for women and girls. If we don't change men and boys, then there's no point. I've had, so the stories that give me hope. So each time I hear back from somebody who said, oh, she wants to destroy marriages, or she's un-African, or that sort of thing. And I also find that a lot of the hostility comes in the language of silencing, where people say, oh, Chimamanda needs to shut up and stop talking about men. And even that is very gendered, right? So often I say to myself, even what you're saying is proof that we need feminism, right? But there are also men who I have spoken to who've said to me, you know, now I'm starting to think about it, and you know, and they seem to think yes. And there's a man who said to me fairly recently, I think I'm a feminist. I never thought I would say that. And for me, it's hope. I think that if to change one mind is hope, it's progress. Because it just means that, you know, there's the possibility of people being happier, of justice. And, yeah.
And just to sort of go back to the President of the United States, I'm sorry to, after that hopeful statement, to return. But just thinking about, again, in this moment, we've spoken about sort of feminism in this moment, and in this moment of Trump and the wall, in this moment of Brexit in Britain and the sort of politicization of the borders, and again, thinking about your short story, American Embassy, which is very much about power and borders, I wonder if you can offer us some of your thoughts on where we are globally in terms of sort of the stringent, or increasingly stringent policing of borders and sort of the push for national identities and sort of loss of almost humanity in our understanding of people and movement. I wonder if you can speak
It's very
to that.
sad. I mean, I think you say it really well. There's a loss of humanity, I think, particularly in the discourse around refugees and immigrants. There's a kind of dehumanization that just breaks my heart, that people are spoken about as though they're not people. We just lose. And I think, and it's, you know, I do think that I understand to a certain extent that we collectively have made, I think, the choice to live in nation states, and nation states necessarily require borders of some sort. And so for me, it's not even a case of all borders should be completely open, but it's simply a case for A, humanizing people, B, realizing that actually there's actually room for people, right? I mean, there's a lot of, when people talk about, oh, the hordes of people are coming, that's actually not really true if you look at the numbers. And then there's a part of me that sort of thinks, if we take a long historical look at it, 150 years ago, you came to Africa without visas. Nobody invited you. No, it's true. You took land, you took resources, the consequences of which people are still living with today. And so if you sort of look at human history, it's sort of like a cycle. It's not that surprising that 150 years later, they would like to come visit you and sort of hang out, and if possible, take your land. Right? I mean, so I kind of think, and it's not to say, and not to simplify it, but simply to say that maybe we should start to think that maybe the discourse should have that shape. Because people often talk about it like, oh my God, it's terrible. And actually, it's not that surprising. You know, we should read some history. Actually, it's a lot more benign this time, if you ask me.
And I'm just going to shortly open up the session to the audience for questions and answers. But my final question will be, are you optimistic about the future? With all that we've spoken about, sort of global changes that are underway, are we heading to global destruction, or is this a new dawn?
Louisa, that's not a fair question.
So it hasn't got to be that polarized.
Is there a third option?
There's the middle ground.
I'll take the middle ground.
Okay.
I want to be hopeful because I have a daughter, and I want her to live in a better world than I've lived in. And I think that there's some reasons to be hopeful. So on the one hand, so for example, the American presidency, disastrous as it is, because now it's worse than a banana republic. And now as a Nigerian, I'm kind of proud because I'm like, oh, that would never happen in Nigeria. Right? I mean, before in Nigeria, we would say, oh, go to America. Americans will never do this nonsense. Now I'm like, really? I mean, even we have some checks and balances. But even that, disastrous as it is, I think we can think of it just as being disastrous, or we can also think of it as having become this catalyst for a certain kind of change. There are many people who are running for office in America who never would have. Where I live, my American home, there are all of these sort of grassroots movements, people meeting and talking about how are we going to unseat this congressperson, how there are women running for office, there's the young people who are determined to vote now, there is a new, I think, kind of a new consciousness about just taking responsibility for your political future. So in some ways, I'm hoping that maybe this will give rise to something else. And in Europe, I don't know enough about Brexit because I'm utterly confused by it.
As always.
But I think that even that, because I remember reading the news and thinking the people who supported it 2 days later were confused about what to do afterwards. So maybe, I don't know, maybe the lessons to be learned, maybe it means, I don't know, what will happen if Brexit happens?
Even our politicians don't know,
yeah.
So...
Yeah, I'm just concerned about my visa. No, I'm kidding.
Okay, so let's open up to the audience for questions. Are there any questions? We have microphones. So I might take a couple of questions at a time. Are there any students on BA English with a question? If not, why not? No, okay. So we'll have one, two to start with. Yeah. There's one here and one behind. Yep. Oh, and we'll do 1, 2, 3. We'll do 3.
Hi, hello. In your short story, The Thing Around Your Neck, you say that America gives and takes. I was curious, thinking about the fact that your work in America, what you have achieved, has given you a platform, given you a voice that is perhaps much larger than it might have been if it hadn't had a presence in America. I guess I wonder what you feel it's taken from you.
Okay, so we're going to do a few questions.
Thank you. I don't actually remember writing that. But I'm also often concerned about being asked about what is in my fiction because there's context, right? And it's about the character, not really me. I often have characters who say and do things that I don't agree with. So I'm always, not that I don't necessarily agree with that bit. I don't remember writing it, but I think it's true. I think America gives and takes. So, but may I just say that while I'm very grateful that America has given me, I think I've also given to America. So, and I say this because there's a part of me that gets just a little irritated when people say, "Aren't you just so grateful that it's happened?" And it's a question that people of color get. I know you haven't. I know you don't mean that at all. But I just wanted to. I took it as an opportunity to just give one of my rants, and it's something that often happens to people of color where. And the underlying thing, it happens a lot in the US, and there's just that ever so underlying idea that you haven't quite earned something, that something was given to you. But with whiteness, that's never questioned. You're never asked, aren't you so grateful? I tried very hard to get a publisher, and they kept rejecting me, and then finally this woman said, I will take a chance on you. And 2 weeks later, a publisher had bought the book, and then it was published. And I think even my first publisher, was shocked that the book got on the independent booksellers' bestseller list, because I think they just thought nobody really wants to read about Nigeria. We'll just publish this because we'll feel very worthy that we've published this. We'll feel very noble. Look, we published a book by an African. What has it taken? It's taken from me my ability to concentrate and focus. Because America is just that way. It's taken from me my ability to write longhand, because I was forced to type when I went to undergrad in the US. So now it's so hard to write longhand. I used to write my stories longhand before, and there's a romance to write in longhand that I miss. But I think it's really also just, and maybe it's not I don't want to put it in a sort of very simplistic way, taking, but the idea that America forces identity on you. It has its good and its bad. The fact that I had to become black in America, and that I wasn't really prepared for it when I got there. I didn't really understand being black because I came from Nigeria, where I was an Igbo and I was a Catholic Christian, and those were the identities I grew up with. And suddenly to go to the US and to become black and to have to learn what it meant, because it means something, and to have to resist certain things, that's a particularly American experience. And and America, I think, has also, it's given and it's taken. But but really, life is about give and take. So
Hi. Just wanted to ask something about the importance of language as writers and journalists. So how do you think the importance and the way we use adjectives, nouns, and words in general can shape the perception and the cause of feminism itself all around the world? I think about myself when I have to write an article, I'm very much careful the words I use to support women causes or feminism in general, but I've seen many and many articles of like words and describing things, and so just like, oh,
give me an example.
That was women's, the skirt she was wearing, or she didn't do the dishes, so the husband go crazy and they killed her. So this kind of way of reporting news or reporting women's issues, or in general, I think it can apply everywhere. So how do you think it literally shape the way we perceive feminism, and we can help feminism itself?
I think language is always important. It's always important to question the language that one uses. And I find myself in writing nonfiction. I don't do it with fiction, because fiction for me is art. But with nonfiction, I do try to be careful, because I think also the way that we've been socialized, I think that we're all, that misogyny is in the air we breathe in the world. And so we breathe in misogyny, women and men. And that sometimes it's so unconscious we don't even know. And I think it can come in the kind of unconscious language that we use. And I find myself wanting to be very careful and sometimes failing. I mean, and it's, little examples, like a friend of mine was telling me that she had been to the doctor. And she said it in Igbo. And Igbo pronouns are not gender specific. So, and she said, meaning the doctor was good. And or is the pronoun. And then I switched to English and I said, so what did he say? And so my friend starts laughing, and she said the doctor was a woman. And I remember just feeling ashamed of myself. I thought, here I am, Madame Feminist icon, right? And I sort of go around and I tell people, oh, feminism. And it was unconscious. And so it's that thing having to, the doctor can in fact be a woman, right? But the socialization that I've received my entire life, the idea that, sort of maleness comes first, even just that, it's a tiny example, but I think even that it's important to, constantly remind oneself, because that's the way. And if we do that, and if younger people coming up, hopefully at some point, the generations coming up will not need to do that, because then it will be normal for them. That's the hope, at least.
Hi. I'm a big fan, first of all.
Thank you.
But I just wanted to say, as a black Nigerian woman in America, do you find that there is like almost a battle of the stereotypes of black women? So you have, for example, an educated woman, a writer, and then you have the women that you see on reality TV. Do you think there's a battle in the depiction of how black women are portrayed and perceived? And do you feel you're in that battle?
I don't watch reality TV, so I don't know what it is. Is it like Big Brother Africa? Or...
Real Housewives of Atlanta, Love and Hip Hop.
Oh, those kinds. Hey, Mbakwa. I mean, no, I don't. I know too many black women who are not like that. I don't feel threatened by those depictions. I do think that there is often, it can sometimes feel to me like a conspiracy in the media, especially the US media, to portray blackness in a particular way. It can often feel like that to me. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist ordinarily, but I sometimes wonder, I feel that their understanding of what blackness is very narrow. So there's sort of, in some ways it's similar to the professor saying to me, authentic African characters. So there's certainly, authentic blackness means you must have a hard scrabbled life story, and then you have to talk in a particular way, and it helps if you can do the moves, and the black women who can and black women who can't. And I just feel like it's changing a little, because we have amazing people in the world like Shonda Rhimes. She's really changing what it means to be a black woman on television. So I would deeply and strongly recommend that you perhaps stop watching the reality shows and watch something that Shonda has done, or something that Ava DuVernay has done.
Okay, some more hands. Shall we take it's one hand here and one in the middle there? Yeah, so.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I love your work. I absolutely adore your writing. And my question is a bit cheeky. I believe your last novel, Americana, was published in 2013. And since then, we've had two non-fictions, We Should All Be Feminist and Dear Ijewele, which are, I believe, transcript of public works you've released. When should we expect your next work of fiction? I really want to read your new work, so please tell us, please. Thank you.
I would tell you, but then I would have to kill you. I don't know. I'm asking myself that as well. When will the next? I don't know. I'm trying my best. Just keep me in your prayers.
Okay, there's just one straight ahead there.
Father Chikwenda.
Hi, my question would be regarding your bookshop in workshop in Nigeria. Coming from African parent, I know that is very common that in some African family we encourage, their kid to do, like, for instance, you have to be doctor or you have to be like a lawyer, and I just want to know, like, how by maybe doing your workshop in Nigeria, it might change the perception some parent or older generation may have on become a writer.
I think it's changed a little. The thing about Nigerian parents is, and I think African parents in general, is that if they become convinced that it's possible to earn money from doing something, they will immediately become supportive. So I think across Africa, there are many parents who now, when their children say, I want to be a musician, they're like, yes, go to the studio. How much do you need to give the producer? Because they're thinking you might be the next, Wizkid or something. And I'm hoping that I do that for writing. but actually to be more serious, because in some ways writing is not music. I mean, and especially writing sort of literary serious fiction. There are many people who it's rare to be able to earn a living from writing literary fiction. And so what I generally say to people who want to write on the continent is that it's not such a bad thing to have another job. Right? It's probably going to be a bit more difficult because then you have to. But then many writers outside of Africa have jobs. They teach because they can't make a living from writing. And I've heard from many young people who've said that their parents have been a bit more supportive because they have said to their parents, "I'm going to be the next Chimamanda," and their parents think, "Okay, that's not too bad." So I think it has changed perceptions, actually. I think it's changed perceptions quite a bit. And also that there's just a flowering of writing, that there are many more books being published, that you go into a bookshop in Lagos and there are many books by Nigerian writers. And so the idea of writer has become a thing in a way that it wasn't, I would say, like 15 years ago. But it's still a work in progress. I think that we still need work to get to Wizkid levels.
And shall we have this gentleman at the back there? Yeah. The gentleman there, and then this lady with the bow in her hair afterwards. Sorry, Zoom.
Do you think would it work better if people just sort of came out and stood in a line and then we would stop the line so that we would drive?
I'm just curious about the idea of the canon, and in particular, so-called canonical works about Africa. So in particular, Heart of Darkness and Things Fall Apart. So what I was wondering is, obviously your work has got like international currency. Do you feel that your work is having a conversation with that sort of linear, with those works that have come before you, and you think your work is shedding light on anything that they might have been missing thus far?
Well, I don't consider Heart of Darkness to be a book about Africa. I think it's a book about the European imagination. And I don't think of my work as being in conversation with anybody's book, really. I don't even think that people who write necessarily think of their books in that way. I think academics think of books in that way. And I do, I mean, you know, and I think it's an interesting thing. I have learned things about my own work from listening to people talk about it, because sometimes I'm like, really? Did I really? So, and I also don't want to think in that way, because I think it gets in the way of your creativity. I think it gets in the way of what I like to call sort of reaching the truth and the core of your art. To think about, you know, am I responding to Achebe, or am I do have to say, though, that Purple Hibiscus I started off Purple Hibiscus with the line, things began to fall apart, because I just wanted to pay tribute to a man whose work I adore. But I don't know if I'm in conversation with him, or certainly not with Conrad, I don't think. But
we just have, I think, one more. And then the last question.
I feel bad for people who want to answer. Let's take 3 more. I'll answer the questions really quickly.
Okay, so we'll do 3 more. Shall I let you? I'll let you pick who.
Oh, God, that's terrible. No. We haven't done any from this side of the room.
Okay, so then we'll do... So there's one here, and then 2 from this side.
Thank you. So I wanted to pick up on the point that you made about Pan-Africanism not ending in the continent, that it includes all of us. And as somebody who's... one of my parents is from Nigeria, and my other parent is English, and I've been born and raised in the UK, and I'm not fluent in Yoruba, and I often get a lot of questions saying, like, how can you be interested in Pan-Africanism when you're not really African, and those sort of questions that people ask, that you were talking about as well, about how you almost have to prove that you're authentically African. I was wondering what your ideas were about, like, how we can engage more in that idea of, like, intersectional Pan-African feminism, and essentially, like, combating those ideas about having to prove your authenticity as an African, or as a Nigerian in general.
Yeah, I think it's by questioning what African means. And also by acknowledging that our having differences in our Africannesses doesn't then mean invalidating the Africanness, if that makes sense. I think, for example, that... so if they say that you're not African, what do they say that you are?
White girl and, like...
No, white people know you're not a white girl, so go on. Yeah.
White children need to wear the sunscreen. They'll look at me and my sisters and, like, make those sort of comments and say, did your mother ever tell you how to make jollof rice? Like, do you know how to speak Yoruba? Do you know how to, like, all these qualifiers?
There are many Nigerians who live in Nigeria their entire lives whose parents do not teach them how to speak Yoruba. No, but it's true. There's a growing middle class of Nigerians who are not teaching their children their languages. So next time they ask you that, tell them that. But also, I think it's important for us to, I mean, that feminism and Africanness and all of these things can be a very broad room. I often find that the Africans in the diaspora who are much more interested in Africanness, much more committed to Africanness than Africans in Africa. And increasingly, I want to measure identity using the yardstick of commitment, not jollof rice.